Okay, everyone. My name is Dan Strachan. You already probably know that I am that little joke. I am a Red Sox fan. I am also the Director of Industrial Relations and Programs here at AFPM in Washington, D.C. And on behalf of AFPM, I'd like to welcome you to this webinar that is sponsored by SchedulePro on API RP 755, past, present, and future. We have a number of people are already online, and before I hand it over to our friends out in British Columbia, I'd just like to go over a few housekeeping things. First of all, we do not have the ability to mute from here at AFPM or out there at SchedulePro. Please put your phones on mute during this time. If you have any questions, please send them to me at dstrachan@afpm.org. That is also up there in the chat function. I'll put that out there several more times. I will take the questions. I will redact any company information, and I will send that to SchedulePro for them to answer. Finally, please do not put your phone on hold, as we all know that sometimes there's some company that has really bad 70s disco music as hold music, and we do not all want to hear that. That being said, again, if you just joined us, please put your phone on mute and pull out your pen and paper, and we will go ahead and start this. Presentation right now, and hand this over right now to our friends out in oh God, that's a horrible picture of me, out in British Columbia. Gentlemen, take it away.
All right, thank you, Dan. Just to kick off, I want to just do a brief introduction of our guest speaker today. We'll have Billy Goodhart, speaking with us and talking to us about API 755 and his background of his knowledge. I believe many of you on the line know Billy already and his extensive experience in the industry. My name is Sachin Agrawal. I'm the CEO at SchedulePro, and I also have been working heavily in the oil and gas industry around fatigue management and scheduling. I'm here to talk to you about my experiences with RP 755 as well. Just a quick agenda to go through what we're going to cover today. We'll go over the overview of the RP 755 rule set as it stands today, what some of those key challenges are to get in compliance and as an organization, and then talk about case studies and learnings of some of the data around what it takes to get in compliance, and then we'll move into the best practices and Q&A from there. So jumping into the overview of RP 755, I wanted to kind of start off just asking Billy a couple of questions as well about RP 755 and his experience. So, Billy, as we look at RP 755 and that as a fatigue risk tool, what have you seen be the approach to safety, and how has it evolved during your career? And what's the next steps in driving safety?
Well, I think the most significant change I saw in my almost 40 years. Yeah, 39 years. You're making me sound older than I am. But in my career, the real change was when I first started, safety was one of strictly compliance, right? What is the OSHA regs? What are the rules we have to follow? What are our statistics? The one of becoming a company value. And that was a significant shift over a long period of time. Because then it was no longer a matter of being overly concerned with what your statistics are. You had everything in place that puts you in compliance with government regulations, and it was really about, are people getting hurt? And we can't have people get hurt. And that became the kind of significant change that I saw over time. far as, you know, injuries and how far it's come, if you go back to like the year 2000, the TRIR in our industry was 1.6. I mean, that would be a horrendous number today. 2017, it was down around 0.4, 0.43, somewhere around that place. So come down significantly over that time period. And part of it is a result of regulations, but part of it is for a lot of the companies in the industry, you know, really taking safety as part of their culture, part of their company value, those kind of things. So that's one of the things that I've really seen over the years. And, you know, fatigue, we're kind of late to the game in fatigue. When you think about airlines and the military and other industries looking at fatigue for much longer. I mean, how many people have been on an airplane where you're sitting at the gate and all of a sudden your flight's canceled or it's delayed further because the crew has exceeded their time in the cockpit, right? And that's all based on fatigue. So it's those kind of things that have changed significantly over our time.
Excellent. So one of the things that I would like to add in here is for folks that are new to fatigue risk and fatigue management, you know, there's been a ton of studies that have gone on relating to why it's important. You know, huge dollar figures if you look at healthcare and costs and injury costs across, you know, the U.S. Economy. But if you are a nerd and want to dive into some studies, there's two excellent research studies here that we'll send out after the presentation. But you can dive in, and these were done by the U.S. Department of Transportation. Net result is that the science shows that fatigue is real, that there is a higher likelihood of accidents, and that those accidents are actually much more dangerous when fatigue occurs. So fatigue risk is a real thing. There are many studies being done across the board. So feel free to reach out after the fact too. We can definitely send you links to the studies we have, and there's a lot of other research online. So when we look at the background of RP755, Billy, I know you were kind of involved in some of the early discussions within API when RP755 was initially implemented. Maybe you can walk us through the background of the regulation and why it's in place.
Well, I think everybody knows that it started with the explosion and fire in March of 2005 at BP's refinery in Texas City. 15 fatalities, you know, a significant event. It was investigated by the Chemical Safety Board, and one of their findings was, and this is the quote, extended working period clearly has the potential to contribute to a lack of attentiveness and slowness to identify and respond to process upsets. That was one of their findings. So then they had a recommendation that API and the United Steelworkers work together to develop a fatigue prevention guidelines that would, at a minimum, limit hours and days of work and best shift work. So what did that lead to? So within Exxon, we had a 4-person team that we put together, which is one of our medical doctors, one of our safety managers, a young lady that was her specialty was what they called human factors, and myself, who really didn't have any specialty, but I was on the team. And we developed what we thought would be a good fatigue management system. And when Dr. Lerman went to the first API meeting, he came in with this as a proposal, and he was one of the few people to have a proposal. And for the most part, it really didn't change much, and that became API 755. So really and I think most of the people on the call know, it really looks at, you know, what causes fatigue, what are the number of shifts, the number of hours, those kind of things that lead to fatigue. And if you have a situation where someone exceeds those limits, how do you mitigate it? And the way you mitigate it is you cite it as an exception. By citing it as an exception, you look at the factors that you can do to mitigate that fatigue. That standard was published in April of 2010. And it really is self-regulation because it's not a standard, it's not a rule, it's a recommended practice. So that's led to a lot of, I would say, a pretty broad spectrum of how people implemented API 755. Some companies have gone strictly by the recommended practice, some have exceeded it, some have not implemented it at all. So I think that's pretty much the background into API 755.
And when you look at the history of 755, you mentioned that the USW was part of the creation of this recommended practice. Maybe you can shed some light on the history of their view of RP 755 and fatigue management.
Well, and initially, because that was the recommendation that they participate in this process, and they did, and when it became clear to the USW that there wouldn't be anything in there about, really what they wanted was that a company would not create vacancy. So every shift, every vacancy, you would have an extra board, an extra body to fill that vacancy, which would force companies to need to hire more people, as opposed to mitigating or by scheduling, using scheduling as a way to avoid putting people in fatigue situations. And when that became clear that that wouldn't become part of the standard, the USW walked away from the process. So the first time the union had an opportunity to negotiate a contract post 2005 was the 2009 negotiations, and there was a lot of process safety stuff that was discussed during those negotiations, but nothing really concrete on API 755. But then in 2012, Shell, and I know Paul Hawes is on the line, Shell negotiated the 2012 process safety letter, which tried to address API 755. And then that led to the 2015 negotiations, which also had another fatigue management letter, which really had less detail in it than the 2012 letter, and it really just talked about reviewing fatigue standards and staffing levels and those kind of things. That's kind of been the history with the union on API 755. Now, after the 2012 negotiations, we really thought, okay, the international wants API 755, but of course, once it got down to the local level, we found out that the local union leadership didn't want to implement 755, and a lot of the ExxonMobil sites and a lot of the other companies, that caused a significant delay in getting API 755 implemented at those sites.
So I think we'll come back and probably talk about it at the last part of the presentation, perhaps the future of RP 755 and where the union stands, and get your take on that. But we'll save that for the last section there. What we'll do now is I'll jump over into discussion of the details of the rules of being in compliance with RP 755, some of the technical details. So just as an overview, RP 755 is around a fatigue risk management process. So as Billy mentioned, fatigue risk is a bit different than fatigue. You really are trying to mitigate as much as possible from a management perspective, creating situations where employees have the opportunity to come to work where they have adequate rest. And then the most effective way to do that is give them uninterrupted breaks of rest. And in the actual rules of RP 755, you'll see that there are hours required there in those breaks of being 36 or 48 hours. One of the key concepts I think that gets people confused about RP 755, at least the way it's written in to the letter, is this concept of a work set. And so we often hear individuals say, "Oh, RP 755, it just means 7 days in a row." And while that is close, it really isn't accurate of what it actually means. And so a work set is the number of shifts or hours that an employee works between getting the rest that they need to sort of reset their fatigue clock, if I can sort of use that word. And so one of the things that's a bit different is that you can sometimes have a day, a break in between, in the middle of your work set, but it's not long enough to actually reset the count. So the work set can actually span breaks of work. So it does make things a little bit difficult, and the whole point of having this idea of a work set and a break is that it creates this discontinuity in work. It forces a break, giving an employee time to recover from fatigue. So there's, this chart. I won't go into too much detail here. Just I'll highlight some pieces. This is from the current RP 755 summary table that's at the end of the presentation. There are a few key points here that you should track. Obviously, that there are the hours of work limits. It's either 36 or 48-hour break required. The 48 hours is a little bit tricky, but you need to track the number of night shifts or the number of shifts you had in a work set. And then there is a summary around maximum number of extended shifts per work set at the bottom. And this gets a bit complicated, but just a couple of key notes is that what this results in is that the 8, 10, and 12-hour rules are actually all intertwined. So if you are an 8-hour employee and you work enough extended shifts, the rules then mean you have to follow the 12-hour rules, and you can switch back and forth between being considered an 8-hour or 12-hour employee. So it's just really important to make sure that even if you have 8-hour employees or 10-hour employees, you really have to know all three of the different guidelines because the different rules can kick in. Just a couple of limitations and gaps. I won't dive in too much. There are a few things that are odd in the way it's written today. So there are some things that you would expect to be defined in the practice that aren't. So it says that there is a maximum length of a single shift, but there's no definition for how many hours of work can happen in a single day. So or number of time off between shifts. So the maximum length of the shift is 18 hours. But they don't say that, hey, you need to have a minimum number of hours off after that 18-hour shift. Similar regulations in the oil and gas, like the Department of Transportation PHMSA rules, do have that limitation in place that you have to have a certain number of hours after a shift. There is some inconsistency in that table I showed you on the previous slide and the written text. We can dive into that after the fact. There are nuanced differences. And the way that the rule is also structured, there are some, depending on the schedule you're working, there are some blackout periods that basically employees are unable to work during those windows, even if they are working their regular shift pattern. I'll go through one of those examples here just to illustrate this idea of work sets and hours off in the break that's required on RP 755. So what I have here in this table is a standard employee schedule if you're working a DuPont shift pattern. So this is fairly common in the industry. I am using DuPont because it does have one of those blackout periods, and we'll kind of highlight it. And what you see in the orange boxes is those are the required work breaks that need to occur after a particular shift. And you'll see that normally it's 36, but after work step 2, you'll see that there's 4 blocks, which means that there's 48 hours break required, and that's needed after 4 night shifts. So here on an employee's regular schedule, you'll see that they have 4 work sets and plenty of break between each of those work sets to reset their count. Now, when you look back to the ruling that most people think of that say, hey, I'm allowed to work up to 7 shifts in a row, you'd think that in this particular case, the employee is nowhere close to being at the RP 755 limits in terms of fatigue. They really aren't in terms of a deviation, but from a scheduling perspective and a planning perspective, there actually are some concern points. So Here, highlighted in red, is where one of those blackout periods occurs for employees on a DuPont schedule. If you work a day or a night shift on that Wednesday, by definition in the RP 755 guidelines, you are in deviation. And this comes from this idea of bridging of work sets. And when you don't have that adequate rest between group days of work, it becomes one big work set because you haven't had time to reset the shifts. And so in this example, if I were to add in this night shift of overtime on Wednesday, it could be the day shift as well. You'll see that work set 2 and 3 become one big bridge because between the night shift and then the last night shift and the 4 in a row and the overtime, there hasn't been a 48-hour break. And then again, after that night shift to the beginning of the day shift, there also hasn't been a 48-hour break. So by the rules in the guideline, the last Sunday here is in deviation. So a couple of really key things from a compliance standpoint that does make this complicated is, as you'll see, that scheduling one shift on a Wednesday of overtime can cause a deviation down the road. And the action of Wednesday is actually within the limits. So the employee went from being nowhere close to being over their limits to having a deviation with just a single shift. And that deviation occurs on that employee's regular day of work. So this is part of their regular pattern. So we'll talk about this in the future, but in order to have compliance with RP 755, you need to be constantly aware of what action you're taking today and how that's going to affect your schedule going forward. And that proactive compliance is absolutely critical. And that really comes into play in the idea of night shifts and call-outs when those happen at the last minute. So on to...
Could I just add something too? It really goes into the development of the standard. When we were working internally within ExxonMobil, and then that translated into API 755, and you have to realize during that process you had many companies involved. You had consultants like Circadian, and you had the union. And I have to give you a little history about how it was developed. So that was a little more history. That was a compromise. API 755 was a compromise because what we did is we licensed a scientific tool that called FAST, which stood for Fatigue Avoidance Scheduling Tool. And this was something that was developed by the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research. And really what it does, it was used to assess the impact of shift schedules on human performance. So it measured what they called percent effectiveness, which translates into fatigue. And there's actually a scientific correlation between percent effectiveness and the effects you have under certain levels of being under the influence of alcohol. You could take percent effectiveness and come up with a number of blood alcohol content. And we use that tool, and you're talking about night shifts, 12-hour night shifts. The fatigue level went up significantly right after 4 night shifts. So that was our original going-in position, which we knew was going to be unreasonable, but because it would be just too difficult to maintain. But that's where fatigue sets in after that 4th night shift. So 7 night shifts was a compromise. And then what happened a year after API 755 was released, there was supposed to be a review. And the Chemical Safety Board came out and said, hey, we need to review this and have public comment and look at changing the recommended practice because the standard doesn't match the science. And that's what they were talking about. And, of course, there was a huge explosion in West Texas, and the review of API 755 got put off, and we'll talk a little bit about the future, but I just wanted to add that piece of the background so people know that even though you may find 7 night shifts difficult to comply with, that was a compromise, and the science basically tells you 4 night shifts.
Just a quick note. There has been a question that was submitted, I think a couple of times, asking about the updates to the RP 755 rules, which are pending. We do have a small point on that in the future section of RP 755. We are awaiting the final approval and release of that new recommended practice, and as soon as that happens, obviously we will update our own application and how we comply with it, but also we'll probably be creating our own set of resources around those new rules and how they are different. So that, just look for that. It will be on our website, and we will be in communication as well on that front. So Billy, as we look forward to companies that do want to move towards RP 755 compliance, what are maybe some of the issues that you see leaders cite as being some of the key challenges or blockers to getting started?
Well, that it's hard, it's difficult, it's a change, and the change is that, you know, in most of these refineries and chemical plants, even though we have overtime rules, and even though we have rules that talk about equitable distribution of overtime, pretty much the ones who want to work the overtime work it, and the ones who don't want to work it don't work that much. And one of the difficulties is that, you know, my terminology, it's an equal opportunity piss-off factor, right? Because everybody, the ones who work a lot of overtime have to work less. The ones who don't want to work overtime have to work more. There's also a belief, and during some of these workload staffing assessments, that you're going to have to increase staff, therefore increase costs. And I know from personal experience that a lot of shift schedules, the way they were established and the way they're supposed to work is that you do have an extra board to cover some of the vacancies. Well, over time, we de-staffed a lot of those extra boards, so you would have to hire to backfill some of those positions. And the fact that, you know, a lot of employees don't want it because of the piece I just talked about as far as the high overtime employees having to come down and the low overtime employees having to go up. And I ran across managers who didn't want it. So you were fighting both sides to try to get this implemented. And then some people already feel that they're doing something similar. You know, different events during the course of a facility's history would lead them to have some kind of fatigue management in place. When I first transferred to Baytown in 1998, we were just coming off a big turnaround, and then we had a plexi-coker fire. So people were on extended work schedules for a long time, and they just started to, you know, okay, this group of people, you need to not come into work for the next 2 days, and so on and so forth, because they were recognizing that the employees were getting fatigued. So there's all those kind of things that cause resistance to implementing API 755.
And then, Billy, when you look at some of the companies that you're working with, I know you mentioned earlier that there have been several who have undergone this process of implementing RP 755. Some have been successful, some haven't. For the folks that are struggling, maybe you can, what are some of the big problems that they're facing actually implementing RP 755?
Well, you still have one of the problems that have existed there from the beginning, and that's there's the issue between the company and the union, and the local union not wanting to have API 755, and that becomes a prevent, because in some cases you have to negotiate changes to your overtime rules. You have a lot of things going on in plants, capital projects, turnarounds that, you know, put this on the back burner to get it employed. One of the things I experienced, we had difficulty getting any kind of scheduling tool to work right. We thought we had developed one in-house, and then we found out it would continue to track things like vacation days as a work day, therefore giving you a false reading at the end of the set that someone might be in a fatigue situation. So those are, you know, and even some companies that, you know, if you purchase the timekeeping system from some companies, they would have a scheduling tool that was part of it, and we found over time that a lot of those scheduling tools don't work.
Perfect. So in my next sort of section here to dive into, I want to talk a little bit about, you know, our experience with rolling out RP755 at Shell and our experience, and then dive into what some of those struggles were that they had. This case study that we have is downloadable on our website, and we do have permission from Shell to present it. So very similar to what Billy said, Shell was in a similar situation when they worked with us at SchedulePro. They had some existing tools which were unable to automate RP755. Shell being a very large organization, one of their challenges that was unique was that they had a large number of facilities and that each of the facilities had multiple local agreements and therefore had unique processes at a site level. And when they evaluated RP755 from a manual perspective of doing it manually, they saw that it would require additional staffing to just do the compliance work, let alone the impacts it would have to scheduling and operations. So our experience with RP755, Shell is our largest deployment of having an organization be compliant. And we were very successful, and overall, some of the key pieces that we're quite proud of is the ability to fully automate the RP755 compliance. So across the board, Shell was a leader in being compliant to the rule set. They also were able to automate compliance with several other regulations from that have safety aspects to them. And the key aspect that was absolutely required for them, again, being a large organization with multiple sites, was the automation of their site-specific workflows. They had sites that had multiple different unions from USW, IWW, non-represented sites, and each of which worked differently, and the tool needed to work together. So as we look forward from that experience and rolling this out at other organizations, kind of want to talk through some of these challenges that Billy mentioned and what we learned and what others they've hit trying to roll this out. The first challenge obviously is hey, it's too difficult to implement. And there is truth to that statement. And really the rule itself is complicated, as we saw on the table, but you know, you could manage that by itself. But what happens when you look at an actual organization is that there's really are multiple things that you as leaders are trying to balance. There is the compliance aspect. Billy mentioned labor agreements that dictate how overtime is distributed and how it works. And then obviously costs are always present in increasing of costs, and just simply hiring away fatigue and having so many extra people that you would never have overtime isn't really an option. So you have to manage your labor costs as well. So the compliance landscape is complicated. You have various labor laws. Some of those are also at the state level, multiple different unions, and then you have other industry guidelines that can be layered on top of RP755 as well. So the PHMSA guidelines from the Department of Transportation, if you have a pipeline control room, OSHA has regulations around training and qualifications, things like that, all layer in and create a sort of a very complex landscape that needs to be intertwined. And then if you are to do it manually, I think I mentioned before that, you know, site-specific processes, each site is different, and they have existing processes and practices in place. So even if it is a non-represented site, it's difficult to do some of those changes around practices. So all of those pieces need to come together for a implementation to work. And so one of the key pieces is that for RP755 compliance, it really needs to start on the scheduling phase. You must build a good plan ahead of time. And as I showed with the example of the bridging of work sets, what action you take today may not cause a deviation today, but may cause a deviation further on down the line. So you have to be looking forward and backwards in the schedule, knowing what's occurring. And this is why solutions that are based off of punch clocks or timesheets, where they just say, hey, I'm going to look at the schedule as it's submitted within timesheets or from a payroll system doesn't really work because they're retroactive. And, you know, that, like in that scenario of the overtime being assigned on Wednesday, the person looks fine, but when they're in deviation is actually when they're on their regular day of work. And now you've created a shortage on your unit if you were to say, hey, this person needs to go home to rest, and the sort of cascading problem continues. The second scenario that I think goes underappreciated is where do these deviations start or stem from? Operations and maintenance employees, they are on a shift pattern, and so they have their regular schedule. And as you saw, that's set and doesn't create any fatigue deviations by the rules. It's when you're adding overtime, an overtime assignment, and especially last-minute call-outs that occur. You know, somebody calls in sick, you know, a couple of hours before their shift. Those are the really critical moments where if the tool isn't looking at the workflows and saying, hey, where are you and what are you doing from a scheduling perspective, and is this going to cause a deviation going forward, that's where problems start. And during OT assignment and these call-out processes, again, with each site having their local practices, we see that those are different. And one of the things that has been a real challenge, I think, for many of our clients is that if the tool that they're working with or the process they're going down doesn't match what the site needs to do in order to schedule and do overtime equalization, they revert to manual scheduling. So whatever they were using before, usually a paper and pencil, maybe a notebook. And as soon as you start scheduling manually, you're not doing the checks and you're not looking forward. And that means that your compliance is manual. These moments are critical that you really think about building in a plan that says compliance is going to be built into these steps. Quickly, just running through some more data here. RP755 will, increase my staffing costs. And of course, this is, a thing we hear a lot. I think Billy mentioned some of this was the angle that was discussed in some of the union negotiations. So, Billy, I wanted to ask you, when you've worked with some of your clients, what's driving this thought around it increasing staffing costs, and is there a way that we can change that perception and the way that this is being looked at?
Well, yeah, I mean, part of it is understanding, one of the things I found out from my experience is understanding what are the drivers for overtime, right? So you look at that first and you try to say, okay, can I eliminate some of these drivers? I was asked at a plant that I worked at in New Jersey some years ago to put together a plan to reduce overtime. So one of the first things I did is I looked at, what was causing overtime, and I found out there were jobs that people just considered overtime jobs, and management accepted that. So if someone had almost half the day was free, they still wouldn't do this task unless it was done on overtime. So it's, part of it is understanding, what those drivers are. And then the other piece is that, you're going to increase, you need to increase staffing. And if you have most of your extra board positions filled, you don't increase staffing. You just distribute the overtime more equitable. And I really think that's, the key part of understanding that API 755 will not increase your staffing costs. It will if you're going to try to manage your business by not creating any vacancies, and that requires you to have a lot of extra people around to fill those vacancies when they come up.
And so this is definitely one of those questions that I have when I work with some of our clients is, hey, can we actually look at RP755 and use this as a trigger to change the way that you look at your business? Billy, you mentioned just questioning some of the business processes. And I actually think that RP755 can actually be a trigger for cost reduction at some organizations. The basic word that you mentioned is that the amount of work doesn't change, it just spreads it to different people. What we have seen, though, is that it does force organizations to do more cross-training. You may have enough, you may not. It really depends on each organization. And the second one is that there is this drive to have higher utilization and make sure that you do keep adequate staffing within a unit. So what we do see is that organizations where they run very high overtime or many operators are being pulled out into different projects can create shortages that are exacerbated by RP 755. So you do run into potential limits, but some of the data here I want to show you is that there are ways that you can identify this ahead of time. So one of them is just to model your site's training matrix, and we can do detailed computation models on how your different training is together. This is just an example of visualizing it, and the thicker the line is between different jobs, the more people who can work it, and the more opportunities there are, and the more lines that are coming in and out of a particular job, the more employees can be shuffled back and forth. So one of the things we do see is that when you have thicker lines and more lines back and forth, it's easier to utilize resources. You can also do modeling of running your organization through RP 755 and saying, hey, based on my training matrix, how likely is it am I to hit shortages, and in which positions would require additional coverage. The basic rule of thumb we've seen, though, is that obviously the more cross-training you have, the better. And when you get to an average of, over 3 posts or qualifications per employee, you start seeing that cross-training really light up and people being able to shuffle around and be utilized pretty easily. So that's just a brief rule of thumb, but again, it really depends, again, on the number of people you have in a unit compared to the number of posts. Billy mentioned extra boards, things like that really do affect it. So you do have to look at this a little bit and say, okay, how close am I to the edge? And then the second one you really want to look at is how are you utilizing your employees? So one of the challenges often is that how do I know, or in the last minute scenario, who can I utilize to come and fill in an opening? And if it is a particular position, say highly trained board position, it can sometimes be difficult to find somebody because there's a limited staff. And you want to have training and or tooling that allows you to look at all the different possibilities of your schedule to say, hey, if I move people around, could I bring in a more junior candidate and sort of bump everybody up into a more senior position? And you want to do this to maximize the pool of candidates. Again, because RP 755 may limit any one individual from working as much overtime, others need to fill in that gap. And really looking at that employee utilization is critical. Again, automated tools can really help here, especially if during a call out in the middle of the night or when you're scheduling, they're evaluating all of these possibilities ahead of time, making it easy for your schedulers or supervisors who are trying to do these call outs. You also want to look at your allocation that you're doing from a staffing perspective and how much you're pulling people on and off of shifts. So again, projects we see being a key thing. This is just an example of a kind of chart that we often see where, hey, there's a lot of time being spent outside of just production work. And so you need to look at, hey, what am I running in my particular unit from an overtime rate? And I'll kind of go into the numbers a little bit into the future, but even if you're running as high as 20% overtime, it is really quite manageable to be in compliance with RP 755. That's kind of the upper end of sort of the overtime rate in a unit that we see without hitting a pace where you need to have many overtime or RP 755 deviations. And so the next one to talk through, Billy, is you mentioned that employees are having have a differing opinion of wanting fatigue management compared to what the USW asked. How have you approached this with organizations you've worked at?
Well, the way we approached it is that, we were going to implement this recommended practice, and starting off with, well, first off, you had to go backwards before you could go forward. So we took about 2 years worth of payroll and try to understand if we were following API 755 for the last year or two, how many exceptions would we have? That was the first piece of data that we looked at. The second piece of data we looked at was going back through all our, past couple of years of incident investigations, how many times did we cite fatigue as a contributing factor? Well, we found out there was none because we never looked at fatigue as a potential contributing factor. We found out that we would have thousands of exceptions. So it was try to understand that history. Then the next part was to get employees buy-in, was to try to do some training, get people to understand what fatigue is, what the fatigue recommended practice was, to try to get them to understand all that, to talk about the effects of fatigue and how it could have implications on the job, those kind of things. So those are kind of some of the things that we really looked at to make people, have people get a better understanding of what it is and what we were trying to do. That being said, you still have people until they get used to the fact that either they're working less overtime or more overtime, you have issues with that. And I think the other thing that I missed when we were first trying to implement API 755 is the fact that it's a comprehensive program. And I was amazed at how much time we just spent on trying to understand lighting in some of the control rooms where we had consoles. And the level of lighting, what people like to do was they all had dimmer switches in these control centers. And they would dim down the lights at nighttime. And we found we had to take out all the dimmer switches, put in more powerful lights, set it up so there's indirect lighting so it doesn't cause glare on the computer screens. But that was a critical, based on the science as we understood it, that was a critical factor in reducing fatigue. So there was a lot of training that went on so people would understand it better and potentially have a little more buy-in into the fatigue management system.
So what I want to do here next is actually layer in a little bit of data behind some of this and how you can identify which employees are going to be impacted through the implementation of RP75, again, based off of the rules that we had earlier. So what we see is it really does depend on the shift pattern you're running. I've put these numbers in for the operations group, which tends to be the most impacted, but there are slightly different numbers for maintenance. So DuPont and the EOEO or EOWO, depending on what you want to call it, are the most common shift patterns we see. So technically, employees who are on these patterns, if you were to maximize every possible opportunity for overtime and stay within the limits, you can work about a 33% overtime rate. And again, when I talk about overtime here, I'm using sort of the, say maybe the engineering definition. It's the percentage of overtime hours over the total hours you work, not just as a comparison to your straight time hours, just clarity for folks who are interpreting this. In practice, though, having all of those stars aligned so you can maximize your overtime, week after week after week doesn't really occur for most employees. So we see sort of a likely maximum that employees would hit would be about 28 or 26%. And then in reality, there's other things that hit. So what we see is the sort of location where we see a common high for employees to sort of plateau is in this 23 to 25% range, or 21 to 24 for an EO schedule. So these are your employees who are the overtime hogs, so to say, that really want to have overtime. And so what you want to do is, this is a common sort of distribution curve we see, is you want to look at your own version of this and see how different that curve looks, what percentage of your employees you have that are above those limits. And then what we see is that you then have to just sort of see if you have employees that are working much above that 25% overtime, how many people are there, how much overtime are they doing, and that difference of them moving down to that 25% limit is really the overtime that's going to need to be filled in by everybody else in the organization. What we normally do see is that there are a pretty high spike of employees that don't like any overtime, so you can see that sort of jump there. And these are the folks that tend to kind of get pushed into starting to be forced for overtime. So that's just one way you can start to identify who would be impacted. Again, just as a quick summary of some of the technical challenges that sites run into that you want to make sure you have in your mind is that proactive assignment, really making sure you've looked at your training matrix and you're utilizing every resource, and really think about your OT scheduling process and your call-out processes, and make sure that compliance is built into those processes so that your schedule is compliant from the get-go. So I want to really sort of transition into the future of RP 755. We've had a few questions come in over the chat here, and so Billy, I'll kind of throw this to you. The first question was, fatigue is a safety issue. What role does the safety department play in implementing RP 755?
Well, they should be the owners of it. Okay, even though this came out of for the unionized plants, the push to implement came out of union negotiations, and going into a plant there was a belief that okay, the HR labor folks will have ownership for this, but it really needs to be the safety folks who own the process and maintain it, because it's their specialty. Okay, it's not a labor person or an HR manager is not an expert on API 755 typically.
And how do you, what's your experience been about getting buy-in across those different organizations and those different leaders? I've, in my travels through different organizations, sort of seen RP 755 being owned by various groups. Safety sometimes, see it coming out of HR sometimes. All of these different groups have a part to play. How does an organization drive consensus across all the stakeholders?
Well, that's not an easy answer. It was probably one of the more difficult tasks, because, like I said earlier, I came across some managers who didn't want it. Right? They just felt it wasn't important. They didn't believe it really was going to impact safety, and you wind up with your safety managers being caught in the middle. And I think a real big part of it was education and having support from some of our senior leaders that this is something we were going to do. That being said, it wasn't that easy to get a consensus across the groups. But once the local safety manager took ownership for it, then that helped a lot, because the employees viewed that person as an expert. They usually had a lot of credibility in the facility, and they could help push this across the finish line. And that's after everything else is done, right? That's after you understand what kind of work has to be done. I talked a little bit about the lighting, whether labor negotiations that had to be done, that had to be complete. All that stuff had to be done before your safety department could really push the final implementation and continuation of API 755.
So one of the other questions I wanted to move on to make sure we cover here as we're coming close to time is talking about the union negotiations that are upcoming and some of the scheduling asks and fatigue risk asks that are in there, and potentially some of the implications that they have to scheduling. And so, Billy, maybe you can fill us in on what you know and kind of perhaps some of the impacts we need to keep in mind.
Well, and again, there's several complicating factors, right? Chemical Safety Board, I'll get to the negotiations quickly, but Chemical Safety Board has ownership for this. Now, the current administration's approach to the Chemical Safety Board, they've not appointed made any of appointments to that chemical safety board. They're all holdovers from the Obama board, but on 2 separate occasions, the current administration has tried to defund the chemical safety board. So that's the approach they're taking. They're trying to make neuter the chemical safety board, and I don't know what impact that's going to eventually have on API 755. As far as the negotiations were concerned, I recently saw a copy, and everybody I think understands this is an initial proposal, but the NOBP policy that's being floated around there now talks about a different approach at least I think it's a different approach from the USW, where one of their demands is that there would be no manipulation of the schedule so you don't have to schedule somebody in a fatigue situation, right? So, one of the things that your scheduling tools do for you say that if this person works an overtime schedule on the front end of the set, it creates an exception down the line, so I will not schedule that person for the overtime. I'll go to the next one. That's one of the things that the union is proposing companies not do. So it seems to be a little different, and again, I'm not involved in that anymore, but it seems to be a little bit counter, considering that Kim Nybarger is the oil bargaining lead now for the USW, and he's a safety guy. So I'm sure there'll be some clarity when Shell and the USW get further into that. But right now, it's definitely a different approach from the USW than we've seen past.
I did want to add a comment there. You mentioned about this idea of manipulating schedules and not blocking somebody from overtime in the scenario that it may cause a deviation down the line. I think, Billy, you mentioned earlier, or at least in one of our previous chats, that there is a letter that sort of said that if somebody was in a deviation from a fatigue perspective, that they would be able to stay home, or that the companies would pay for them to stay home and get rest. And if you take that into account of that scenario where you don't look forward and you just schedule people for overtime and then you take them off, this can have significant cost impacts for organizations and companies. And I think everybody here on the line should really make sure that if that discussion does happen internally in your organization, you look at it carefully. I have done modeling of this for different organizations in the past. So I think in 2015, when this similar question came up, we did model that for Shell and saw how it would impact their schedules and their costs. And it was significantly higher than I think anybody even predicted. So the cost of doing that and maintaining compliance with 755 would be significant if that was to be agreed to. So just something to be very careful of. Billy, we are coming close. Oh, go ahead.
I just want a point of clarification. So that's if the company, through their actions, sends somebody home on their regular schedule because of fatigue, the companies would pay that person, and that's something we all agreed to do, and it made sense. It doesn't make sense if we can't manipulate the schedule to avoid those situations.
So we're getting close to time here. Maybe, Billy, we can do a rapid fire of a couple of really quick questions here. Did the committee look at any other industries when they were putting together RP 755?
We did. Well, we looked at, in our pre-work, we looked at the nuclear industry, airlines, trains, military. We looked at a bunch of different industries and looked at how they were attempting to manage fatigue.
And there was another question around overtime and which employee base tends to look at overtime and want to ask for more overtime. Is there any patterns or studies done, millennials versus baby boomers, or how can employees ask for more overtime. So, Billy, are you aware of any studies done in this space?
Well, everything I've read about these younger generations is what's important to them is time off. So you would think that they're less interested in overtime because they want more time off.
Okay. So I think we've come to time here. I think we'll wrap it up. We will distribute these slides. We have some best practices or lessons learned data that we will share after this presentation. But I wanted to thank everyone for attending the webinar and for your time today. And I'll hand it back to Dan.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone for your questions and your attentiveness and for not putting your phones on hold. The slide deck will be sent out later this week to all attendees. Again, thank you very much for your time, and have a good day.